On behalf of Radboud Reflects and the Donders Institute, I welcome you to this lecture, to this evening on the clock versus biorhythm. My name is Kees Leijnhorst, and first of all, I would like to congratulate you and myself for being on time, because that's always nice if you are on time, but especially after this weekend, it's a great thing to be on time, because as you know, since you are here, the clock changed, as we call it, this weekend. And this is exactly the occasion for this evening. The daylight saving time, you know, the summertime and wintertime, as we call it, the fact that twice a year we changed the clock and all kinds of bad things happen. People don't, first of all, people don't arrive in time, but more importantly, our biorhythms are completely in disorder and we cannot adapt to this new time and we get sleeping problems and all of that. And every year, but it seems the case that somehow anecdotally I have the idea that this time it was less so. You get this discussion, this European discussion about whether we actually should change the time, the clock, and whether we actually should implement this daylight saving time. I had the impression we did have this discussion in March, but we somehow we don't seem to have it right now. But this could be me, but this is my impression. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about today. What does this sharp clock, you know, being forced to live by the clock, what does it do for your biorhythm? What does it entail for you? Are we actually, as human beings, having gone through a long period of evolution, is it an okay idea to live by the clock? Is it an okay idea to change the clock all the time as we do? What does living to the clock actually mean, and where does it come from? What is its history, and what were the circumstances surrounding the invention and the implementation of the clock? This is what we're going to talk about tonight. We being two speakers, Christoph Lüthy, who is a professor for the history of science and history of philosophy here at Radboud University, and Lisa Genzel, who is an associate professor of neuroinformatics and working at the Donders Institute, which is co-organizing this night, this evening. Christoph will start, and he will give a lecture of exactly 20 minutes, followed by Lisa, who will also give a lecture of exactly 20 minutes. There's a clock here, so you can actually look at it. After that, we will have a discussion, and at some point, I will open the discussion for you, and you can raise your questions. You can ask the questions that you find relevant. And there are a few basic rules for that, but I'm going to explain them when we arrive there. So the floor is Christoph.
Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you here. Kees just mentioned the fact that we've moved from summertime, or as it's called in English, daylight saving time. So I'll show you this. To the regular time that we standardly have. Now the question was, to what extent is this natural, not natural? What does it do to our biorhythm? And as Kees mentioned, I'm going to speak about the historical way in which this timekeeping was all set up. The premise of what I'm going to tell you is that when daylight saving time was first invented, it was meant to be more natural and somehow help us to adjust our biorhythms to to our habits in the summer and in the winter. Now, is living by the clock an imitation of nature, or is it actually a deviation of nature? This is the question I want to ask. Now, many of you will probably have a very clear idea of how our time units are structured, but maybe it's good to go through the list and just see how we ended up with the measures of time that we have. The two medieval ladies standing here are surrounded by the three types of celestial phenomena that define our time, namely sun, moon, and the fixed stars. Now, the biggest unit we have is the year, and that is actually a fairly natural phenomenon in the sense that, as you know, we turn once a year around the sun, and that, looking at, from our point of view, that means that we've got seasonal changes. You go through 2 solstices, 2 equinoxes, and somehow there's a cycle that repeats itself. So that is a natural thing to have. With the next unit, that's only semi-natural. As those of you who speak Dutch know, maand and maan, they are somehow connected, so it's a lunar system, but the lunar cycle is actually not 30 or 30 days, it's 29 and a few hours, 7 hours and a few minutes. So the months are already somewhat adjusted to fit into a solar year. Now, those societies that live by a lunar calendar, like Islam, you may know that with respect to our year, these cultures sort of move with respect to our calendar, so that the fasting month, Ramadan, can be in June, in which case you've got to wait very long before you can break the fast, or it can be in December, so it moves with respect to us. So we have a mixed solar-lunar calendar. The week is utterly conventional, so the week could be 30 days, it could be 5 days, you know. And in fact, the French Revolution tried to adjust it to a decimal system. We happen to have 7 days because of some historical reasons that have to do with the fact that we used to count 7 planets. Now, the day can be conventional or regular, natural. Now, we have 2 meanings of day. One is from midnight to midnight or from noon to noon. If you're an astronomer, you look at the sky and you see that the stars perform 1 circle per day around the polar star, for example. That gives you the measure of the day. Or the only thing that you can measure if you're dropped on an island and you don't have a timepiece would be noon. I don't know whether you know that. But if you're dropped on an island, if it ever happens to you and you don't have a timepiece and you want to know how late it is, you put a stick in the floor, in the ground, and then you look at the shadows, and the shortest shadow is the one when the sun is highest up, which is when the sun is in the south. The shadow is in the north, and that gives you noon. So you can go from noon to noon, and that gives you a day. But that's a day of a full circle. But the second meaning we have is that we actually say day and night. And then the day is not so much the day as in 24 hours, but it would be the day as in from the moment the sun rises to the moment the sun sets. Now, our minute and second, that's all completely conventional, again, and it goes back to a duodecimal system of ancient Babylonia and so forth, so it's all multiples of 12, like the 24 hours and so forth. Now, if we look at Nijmegen, so you get, this is a light and darkness distribution in the course of a year. It's put on the day of today. You've just seen the red line, which is the noon line, has just jumped back again from the daylight saving time up there. And you can see how the light increases in the summer and decreases in the winter. Now, one of the important things for us to know is this. When you go back to the Middle Ages, you have a society that's essentially rural, you know, with something like 95% of the people being farmers or doing farm-related activities, and they live by the sun and by the rhythm of the animals. So what you see here is you have to read this as a one continuous ribbon with the 12 months. It begins on the top left with January and it ends down there in December. Underneath, you always see the typical activities that people would have performed in these months. And above it, you get an interesting diagram. In the middle, you see the ratio between night and day. So if in January it's lots of darkness and a little bit of golden light, and in June it's the other way around. And then you see the lines, and they are the 20 lines of the astronomical hours. And again, you see that some months, January has only 8 sunny lines and 16 dark ones, and vice versa in June. But the important thing to know is that in the Middle Ages, these astronomical hours didn't actually matter, because people lived by a definition 2 of the day, namely the day starts when the sun rises and it ends when the sun sets. That's why if you look at medieval, really old medieval sundials, like this lovely angel at the 13th century angel from the Cathedral of Chartres in France, what you see is it goes from 6 to 6. 6 o'clock is simply, by definition, when the sun rises. And 6 p.m. is when the sun sets. Now this means that the 6 o'clock in June and the 6 o'clock in December were very, very different in those days. Now, what would that mean? Now let's take the case of Nijmegen. The sunrise here, according to the modern clock, is 5:17. Sunset is at exactly 10 o'clock. That means you've got 16 hours and 43 minutes of light in June, on June 21st. And if you divide that into units of 12, then you get an hour of 84 minutes. So in the Middle Ages, you would have very sort of extended summer hours. In the winter, it's exactly the contrary. Sunrise at 8:42, sunset at 16:26. You only have 7 hours and 44 of light, and that means you get hours which pass very quickly. And that's not just theoretical, that's how people lived. And one lovely way how do we measure what that meant? In the history of philosophy, there's a very famous case. You go to the University of St. Andrews. St. Andrews in Scotland is even further away from the equator, where the hours are always equally long. So it has even an earlier sunrise and even later sunset in summer, and even darker in the winter. Now what happens is, students in St. Andrews in the winter, they had, summer and winter, they had lessons, and the lessons were meant to be an hour, and the professors would dictate texts. That was before the age of printing. There you see a professor sort of reading out the text, and one student down there writing it down. Now, what you can see is, if you look at 15th century student notebooks, you see that they have in a summer lesson 3 times more text than in a winter lesson. Which is exactly, this is exactly what we've just seen with the Nijmegen case. A summer hour is much longer than a winter hour. But this all means that you live by you start working when the sun comes up, and you stop working when the sun goes down. Now, the question is, where does the mechanical clock, which came to terrorize and discipline us more and more, where does that start? And now we have to tell a story that it's quite an unexpected angle to start. Namely, it goes back to the fairly severe rules that certain monastic orders had. Rules that said that there are canonical hours in which you have got to pray or sing. And here are some of them. Now, I'm not going to bore you with which order had which rule in which century, but believe me that if you are a Benedictine, you had to get up at night to sing the Matitine or the Matins, because that was before sunrise. If you have vigils, it's even worse. It's at midnight. But what that means is that you need to somehow keep time even when it's dark and you have no sundial to look at. So what do you use to keep track of the time at night? You use a sand glass, right? So you know, for example, that in the winter, the sunset is I don't know, here in Nijmegen at half past 8, and you want to have the the matins half an hour before or an hour before, and then you turn the sun dial, the hourglass until the moment has come. Then you chime the bell, wake everyone up, and go to Mass. But then what you get is the Frère Jacques problem. You know, I'll give you the French version because that's the only real good version. You probably all know the canon of this Frère Jacques, dormez-vous? And it's, you know, sonnez les matines, ring the bells. Are you sleeping? Ring the bells. This thing has been mistranslated into English and Dutch. Morning bells are ringing. No, the morning bells are not ringing. The guy who should ring the morning bells is asleep because he looked at the hourglass, at the zandloper, and fell asleep while doing it. So, you know, instead of keeping watch and waking the others up, he falls asleep, and so no one goes to matins. And now our modern clock is the effect of an alarm clock. Our modern timekeeping starts with the monastic problem of falling asleep in front of the hourglass, and here you get the oldest, you know, sort of a 14th century type of an alarm clock, which was, you know, so Frère Jacques can fall asleep because there's going to be drrrr, and he will wake up and then chime, and then, you know, God is being praised in the hour in which he has to be praised. And then people started seeing, so how does this work? I mean, it's easy enough. It was an ingenious invention. You use the gravitational pull, which is constant, and you need to have a mechanism that somehow folio escape it or something that regulates to pull down, and that translation then gives you kind of isochronous measurement. But whereas people would say, oh, now they've invented the clock, hooray, well, they didn't, because it took quite a lot of time before people actually thought that this was useful for timekeeping in general. Because this keeps, if you now let it run all day long, it does repeat, in a way, the circle of the stars or of the sun around the Earth, but it doesn't, or, well, our rotations, but it doesn't give us the traditional seasonal hours according to which everyone was living. And you see that when you go and look at medieval clocks. Now here you get a clock in Bern, Zeitglocke, and the Zeitglocke is actually the clock, the time clock. And if you look at the top part is more modern, and the medieval one is down here. So like in many of these medieval clocks, you get a 24-hour thing, which somehow reproduces the celestial movements, right? Around once a day. And that has the Roman numerals around it. But I don't know whether you can see it from where you're sitting well enough. On the red circle, you get the seasonal hours going from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So this rim there goes, this bar there goes to 12. And that is actually, for the Middle Ages, people continue to live not according to this astronomical time, but still according to this seasonal time, which would simply start, in this case, with 1, whenever it was that the sun was rising. And it took centuries and centuries for the astronomical hours to beat the seasonal hours, these elastic hours, which could shrink and increase, beat them out of the market. And it happened because of commerce. It just turned out that after a while, it was actually very, very good for cities to have a regular rhythm year in, year out. And you can see that the first places that set up clocks were mercantile cities. So here you get some of the oldest ones that still exist in Orvieto and in Venice, but you know, in Italy you see a number of other ones. In England you get old ones, but they are usually attached to cathedrals and are more sort of tied to not so much commerce, but the you know, church rhythms. Now, so you got slowly you got these towns having a rhythm that followed no longer sunrise, sunset, but sort of these celestial regular hours that would just beat 8 o'clock, whether it was dark or whether it was sunny. The countryside, I should here add, didn't do any of that. So the countryside, which until the 19th century was the biggest part of society, kept going by the old time units. And it was only the cities that followed this new rhythm. Now, in the 18th century, because of an issue that I can't explain now, but it's a beautiful story, the longitude problem. If you're on a ship and you get lost, how do you know where you are? And one way would be to measure the local differences of time with the difference for the port of departure, because that will tell you where you are on the globe. I'm happy to explain it later, but the question was, how do you get a clock that keeps time on a boat? And all the old mechanical clocks with a pendulum, of course, they don't work on a boat. So big prize money, and John Harrison won the prize money in the end with this first portable clock. And with this portable clock, once you mass produce that, it is, the progenitor of, I'm an old-fashioned guy, so I still have a watch. Many of you may have just a phone with the time on it. But time here becomes, for the first time, something that you can take along and have in your pocket. And that's when the tyranny of time starts. The feeling that we all have, that we are always late, always behind time, because you've got an appointment at 8:15 and then 9:15 and so forth. So this idea, oh dear, I shall be too late. So that is only possible once all of us have fairly reliable timepieces in our pockets, and we can, Kees was happy that you were all on time. We are now, this has become, sort of just natural to us that we can all check what time it is and carry this time around. Now, what happened is that this was all very fine, but then it was still the case that time was local time. So if you look just at the little country in which we live, if you look at the sunrise today in Groningen, in Maastricht, and in Middelburg, you will see a 10-minute difference. So if noon, which you can measure, I told you how, but noon is the only moment in the day that everyone can measure. If you set your church clock or your watch to 12 o'clock local time, then it's pretty difficult to, in a day and age of mass communication, mass travel, to get your clocks aligned. So the problem arose in the 19th century with the telegraph, the invention of the telegraph, and with the trains. So first, what was done was to invent a train hour. So the Netherlands, I just stick to this country. So Venlo and 's-Hertogenbosch and all these places would still have their local times, but the trains had a special time that was based on the clock on the Royal Palace in Amsterdam. But at some point, this got too complicated, and there was more and more international travel, and indeed telegraphs and so forth. And so one made international train tables which were valid for entire chunks of Europe. And the funny thing is that the Netherlands, for quite a few decades, had a sort of an exceptional status. It was Greenwich train time minus 20 minutes. So that was a lovely short period. But now this is the situation that we have now. This is how the world is sort of sliced up. And Lisa will say something about this in a minute, I think. Our own slice is, of course, very big, and it's very strange that we have the same time as Spain, but not as England. So these kinds of things, that the sun takes quite a bit of time to cross our time zone. Now, the last thing I have to say, and then I'll hand over, is how did we get to the daily, to the sunlight saving time, to this thing? Now, the thing was first proposed in a somewhat different form by Benjamin Franklin, of all people, when he was ambassador to France, in what was really just an ironical piece. He wrote to the Journal de Paris in an issue that actually starts with, I don't know whether you can see it, it starts with saying when the sun sets and rises and so forth. And he says urban life in Paris has become such that people frolic around at night, and then they sleep most of the day, and so it would be much more useful to change. He didn't say change the clock, he said change the hours in which the activities start. But he was the first one to say, if we adjust our behavior to the clock, or the clock to the activities, we can save a lot of money, of energy, and so forth. It's economically very interesting. Now, when this idea was really enacted was in times of warfare. So the first time that there were countries using this daylight saving time was in the First World War. And here you can see quite simply, set the clock ahead 1 hour and win the war, quite direct, save 1 billion tons of coal by using an extra hour of daylight. And in fact, the Netherlands had daylight saving time from 1916, middle of World War I, until 1945, end of the Second World War, and then again in from 1977 onwards, after the oil crisis, when the idea was again, let's adjust the clock to the way we live in the summer. So with this idea that it would be healthier for us, but also economically good. Now, this is what the map looks like nowadays. What you can see three things. You can see that the majority of nations don't have daylight saving time. You see that some countries have it only partially, so you see exceptions in the United States. And you also see that Australia only has one part, I think Queensland and one other part having daylight saving time, the rest not. You also see the colors indicate whether they are doing it at the same time or not. So Europe and Greenland, we're doing it en bloc, but each of these other countries, other colors, means that they are doing it at a different moment. So this is also maybe one of the things we'll talk about. Now, let's sum up. It all starts with monks falling asleep instead of praying. So that's the alarm clock, and I find it quite witty that all of this starts with an alarm clock. And then it takes hundreds of years for the clock, the mechanical clock, which goes regularly, just 24 hours, to impose itself. And it first does it in commercial big centers, and then slowly also the countryside. And then at some point, again, because of a technological issue, you get the portable time that you walk around with. Telegraphs and trains require global time zones, and then wars and crises lead to this adjustment to daylight saving time. Now, what does all of this do to our poor bodies? And that's what we are going to hear next. Thank you.
So I'll look at my clock for the timing. So first I have to ask, comes a typical chrono joke in a way anyways, but can we please turn on the lights a little bit more? Especially in the audience. I would like to see the audience. Thank you very much. That's already a much better start. Because as I said, this is a little insider joke from people working with chronobiology. It's like, we should know better. You're sitting in the dark. You're going to fall asleep. You're inactive. This doesn't work, but okay. There's also a different reason why I need the light, because I will ask you to raise your hands a few times during the next 20 minutes. So what we're going to talk about is first off sleep. So let's start. How much do you sleep? We're going to start. I'm going to give you numbers, and you put your hand up when you feel that you belong to that group. So, who sleeps 4 hours a night? Who sleeps 5 hours a night? We have a first one. Who sleeps 6 hours a night? Who sleeps 7 hours a night? Who sleeps 8 hours a night? Who sleeps 9 hours a night? Who sleeps 10 hours a night? But not really, because if a baby wakes me up. Okay, who sleeps 11 hours a night? Okay, we're already out. Number one, thank you very much. You've just once again produced a Gaussian curve. Gaussian curves are beautiful, they always work. So as you noticed, we had a very, very wide range. And I'm not going to tell you that if you sleep 5 hours a night, that it's not enough. No, it's completely enough for the person for whom this is the right amount of sleep. Just like 10 hours can be completely normal for whoever wants to sleep. But now comes the next question. Does this differ between a workday and a free day? If yes, hand up. why? This is so it's completely illogical. Why should that differ, right? Why should there be a difference? But of course there is a difference. So here you could see a nice, I don't know if this pointer, I didn't try which is the pointer. Okay, you see on the top row, you'll see those are the work days, the average nicely distribution about how long we sleep. And then the middle one is your free days. And it's clearly visible to all of us that it's shifted to the right? We sleep longer on free days than we do on work days. And yes, if you go now to the bottom, the nice, beautiful average, you can see, yes, you heard the classic 8 hours. Yes, 8 hours is roughly, 7 to 8 hours is roughly the average between us. But this is, ironically, it has to be brought together by free days where we kind of catch up with our sleep because we did not sleep enough during our work days. And the other thing, as I said, it's a Gaussian distribution, which clearly means that the majority of the people will not be at 7 or 8 hours. 7 to 8 hours will be the average middle, right? But that still means if I would count everybody together who's outside of that, you're probably actually more people. It's completely normal to have this variation where some just need naturally 5 to 6 hours of night, and then they're happy and they're fine. And then there will be totally natural sleepers who need 10 to 11 hours. And as I said, those people are not lazy. They just need more sleep. But now comes the next question, because of course this is tightly interlinked with how much you sleep. When do you go to bed, or when do you sleep? This is, of course, the difference between going to bed and when you fall asleep. But let's say, roughly, when do you fall asleep and when do you roughly get up? So again, we're going to do this time game. So first, going to bed. Let's start with who goes to bed at 6 p.m.? Yeah, obviously, else you wouldn't be here, right? Who goes to bed at 7? Who likes to go to bed at 8 if you didn't have to be here? Who at 9? Who at 10? Who at 11? Who at midnight? Who at 1 a.m.? Who at 2 a.m.? Who at 3 a.m.? So, nice Gaussian distribution, very nice. We saw again, right, it started between roughly, let's say 9 was the first ones, and then 10, 11, 12 were the most were, and 1, 2 is still somewhat. Fits perfectly, so thank you very much that you reproduced some science. But the next one will be, if you don't have, right, let's say if you can just free life, right, when would you get up? Who gets up at 3 a.m.? Who gets up at 4 a.m.? Who gets up at 5 a.m.? Who gets up at 6 a.m.? Who gets up at 7? Who gets up at 8? Who gets up at 9? Who gets up at 10? Who gets up at 11? Who gets up at 12? Okay. We still have 12. Okay, thank you. Why does the world start between 8 and 9 a.m., please? You are all in bed. Or some of you are awake, but you maybe just got up. Because this is kind of this unlogical thing that currently what you just produce has nothing to do with the world, right? And how we're currently expected to work. I mean, it's in the Netherlands a little bit better than, let's say, in Germany, but still, it doesn't make any sense. Because now, again, the question, because before I just said, well, when you would roughly want to, does your go to bed and get up times, are they exactly the same between weekends and weekdays? If yes, hands up. Ooh, we have a few. But okay, for the majority of the people, this will not be the same. And let me guess, for the people who it was the same, you were more on the edge of the early people maybe? Because those are the ones who are more likely to being able to live their chronotype kind of during the day. And now comes the key question. Do you use an alarm clock? Hands up, who uses an alarm clock? Be ashamed, right? The alarm clock, I mean, now I even might joke, this is a typical joke of mine actually, but it works even better if we hear the history in a way, but this is the most evil invention of humankind. Yeah. If you use an alarm clock, you are chronically sleep deprived. It's a very simple way of finding out if you're sleep deprived. Do you wake up before your alarm clock? Like, is it a natural thing? And do you feel awake? Because, of course, the problem is at one point you're so entrained, you will always wake up before. But usually the trick is if you really need an alarm clock, you have a problem. You're not living right. Of course, there are situations where you need one, can avoid it, just like there are jobs where we can't actually really do what we want to do. We actually have to work at shifts or something. But in general, our society should be able to organize the world that we don't need naturally alarm clocks, because they are shortening your sleep. Sleep is important. We cannot talk about why sleep is important because I don't have 3 hours, but sleep is very, very important, and that's actually the majority of my research. But what we're going to talk about now is more about light and timing, because this whole difference between when do you go to bed and when do you wake up, as you saw, there was again a Gaussian distribution. And the reason is that we have chronotypes. So the chronotypes, for one side, if you know the two extremes, we would call the very, very early ones the larks. So that's the picture on the left. And then the very, very late chronotypes are the owls. And this picture very nicely actually depicts a relationship I did have. It only lasted 3 months, probably because of this, but we did have that thing where he wanted to go to bed at night every time at between 8:30 and 9. That was his thing, and he would get up at 5 a.m. And he really expected me to just lie there. Sorry, I'm a late chronotype. I will not sleep until 11 or midnight. So this was my night, and I was very unhappy. But it can work. I know another couple where he goes to bed at 8:30 every day, and he wakes up at 4 a.m. every morning, because that's his chronotype. His wife goes to bed at 3 a.m. and gets up at 12. They have a very happy relationship for a few decades already, even so they only overlap 1 single hour in bed. Maybe because of that, but you never know, right? So, okay. But yes, so this is the thing about chronotypes. So chronotypes are genetically determining when you're sleeping. And your chronotype is also not static, because this is actually how it looks like. So a good way to measure chronotype was invented by Till Rönneberg, where he takes mid-sleep. So let's say you go to bed at 11 p.m. and you get up at 7 a.m. Then your whole night was 8 hours, so your middle will be 4 hours. That means you go from 11, 4 hours in, that's 3. So that means that person who would sleep like that would have a chronotype of 3. As you see, that doesn't exist roughly, right? All our means are much, much later. Ironically, you would need the chronotype of 3 to be able to deal with the average society and how they expect us to live. But in reality, we tend to be much later. But the more interesting thing, we change throughout our lifetimes. And now anybody who has young children will very much recognize this. And everybody who was a teenager will also very much recognize this. Because what actually happens is that you start incredibly early as a chronotype. And that's why it is our little toddlers, and it says, I'm currently suffering from that. I'm a late owl who has a toddler. So that means that my toddler wakes me at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. And yes, sorry, I'm suffering. But at least you know the toddlers, they really go with the light. So they're the ones who are actually up before sunlight, right? And then they go to bed as soon as it gets dark, right? They go to bed at 7 or 8 p.m. I mean, that's ridiculous. But you see, that's what your toddlers do, right? Then when you get older, okay, the toddlers don't actually fill in the questionnaire, so we don't have them in there. But when starting 10-year-olds, you can kind of fill in the questionnaire. So then you get into this nice graph, and what you'll see is that, right, we get later, and then it's at the end of adolescence, where we have that flip over. But that means that as a teenager, you're incredibly late as a chronotype. And that's why if you remember school starting at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. if you were in the Netherlands, 8:45 I heard when you're in the Netherlands, I kind of assume that all of you who were teenagers maybe think back about time, how hard it was to get out of bed, how much, like I spent all my high school years dreaming of my nap in the afternoon because I was so tired. Or if you're a little bit older and you already had teenagers as kids, you're probably going to remember the times, how hard it was to get them out of bed to go to school. And actually all this is really ridiculous because all this is nature. And we're trying to deal with an artificial construct that sends kids to school at 8 a.m. And it doesn't have to be that way, because it has a purpose, probably. And so at the end of adolescence is when we get earlier, and then we will get earlier again. And then, as I said, I promised a few jokes, but no, I have the problem that my pointer doesn't work. So the jokes that I can tell you is that you can see there's a difference between male and females, right? The male, on average, will get later before their switch point, which means that if you look at the same age, they're always in different chronotypes on average. However, if you want to flip how they fit together, so when are men and females, or men and women, when are they on the same chronotype, then you realize it's an age gap of roughly 2 to 3 years. Does it sound familiar? age gap of 2 to 3 years has actually been shown to be kind of the typical difference between the couples. So maybe we select our partners by chronotype. Then another one is that, okay, again, I'm going to make my toddler joke. Sorry, you're not laughing very much. I must be not very funny today. But at least my toddler, going back to toddler jokes in a way, if I really understand this joke, I said it's not even my original joke, but I completely understand it now, is that this is the reason why grandparents should be taking care of the children. They're on the same chronotype. They fit together. Not me, but okay. So these are all kind of the reasons why you should think about, or in a way, appreciate the chronotype in a way that it will determine how much you're suffering. Because this is, again, the difference of how much you're sleeping. So going upwards, you see the amount of sleep that you can get, and then going on the x-axis, that's, again, the chronotype. And what it's telling you is that if you're very, very, very early chronotype, then you, in free days, so those are the white dots, you're actually sleeping less than on working days. So this is what we call a scissor. Then if you are this chronotype that is around 3, and that I was telling you was right, going to bed at 11 and getting up at 8, then you're actually sleeping the same amount on free days and on working days. Now, the later of a chronotype you are, the more you're going to have this difference where you're now on free days are going to oversleep to try to compensate, because during work days you're undersleeping. And this is, of course, because on work days you're being woken up too early, so you have to catch up with sleep. And that's what you're doing on free days. And the reason why the really early chronotypes have the opposite effect is stuff like this. Right? I mean, we're now on a weekday, but normally social life tends to happen in the evening. And so that means that extreme early chronotypes who want to naturally go to bed at 8, 9, or 10 will be actually sleep deprived as soon as they engage kind of socially with other people. And so that's why this difference between kind of how much you sleep during free days and work days and when you're sleeping, this is what was determined the social jet lag. Because actually, if you go down to the differences, the average person, so then going back to our nice Gaussian curve, the average, sorry, I have to say German, because this is all based on a questionnaire that was mainly performed in Germany, but at least the average German will go to bed naturally between 11 and 1 a.m. This fit exactly to what you guys actually were doing with your hands, right? Everybody was between 11 and 1 a.m. And that means that the average getting up time, which is the natural one, would be between 7 and 9 a.m. And that means that if you live in a society, and I said Germany society tends to want to go to, it forces you to go to bed at like at 10, 11, and work starts at 8. Here, as I said, the Netherlands is at least a little bit better, because here work starts on average on 9. I also lived in the UK, much nicer, because work starts at 9, plus they have a different time zone. And so all this will contribute to how much you're in a way suffering. And so this difference between when should we be sleeping, when should we be awake during weekdays versus weekends, actually is a time zone difference of flying every weekend to New York. So imagine that every weekend you're actually spending in New York your social life, and then every week you come back to spend in Central Europe from Monday to Friday. That doesn't make sense, right? Nobody would do that. Why do we do that? I mean, really. But that at least is called the social jet lag. And so the social jet lag is bad for everybody, but of course late chronotypes will be much more suffering from those social jet lags. Now, for the final bit, we come back to our daylight saving in a way, then daylight savings should be good. Not really. Because, well, as we were just explained, it was kind of introduced to bring back kind of a more natural rhythm into the rhythm. It kind of went the other way, because this is the standard time as it is. And I liked the map you showed before, because, when the Netherlands had this little 20-minute extra timing thing, they were right. Because back then, actually, you could see that the time zone switch in Europe was in France, which made much more sense, because if you look at it now, right, we have Central European time, which is actually timed towards where Germany, Italy, and everybody else is in the middle. So what you see here, right, the back colors are the sun time, And here the countries are now colored according to which sun time they're living by. And there you can already see that all of Western Europe has already the problem that they are currently living on this one whole time zone separated. And then what does daylight savings do? Daylight saving enhances this difference, because daylight saving now shifts everything by even another whole time zone. And so at this point, we are only maybe, okay, even the Netherlands, right? The Netherlands is already on the other side. So the Netherlands would be living 2 hours off daylight saving time. And so that's why it was kind of ironic, because it was actually the chronobiologists who were really campaigning against the end of daylight saving, because it's so bad for our sleep in some ways. But the problem that they did get the referendum, I don't know if you realized that a few years ago we did have a European referendum of getting rid of daylight saving, and then yes, the population voted for it, right? They voted for the abolishment, everybody was happy, but whoops, they gave them the choice about what to switch to. And the problem, even I did it wrong. I filled in the question and realized later I picked the wrong thing, because my brain, it's also confusing thinking about daylight saving and saving an hour or not, because the problem is they all voted to keep daylight saving forever, which means we would live in winter completely off from chronotime, which would make it really difficult. And that's the reason nobody ever put that votum into real life action, is because the chronobiologists screamed and said, never, don't do that, it's going to get worse. And so that's why it kind of just disappeared and nothing happened from it. Because this is actually how we should be living, and this is what we should change. And I must say, having lived in the UK, where I was farther north with less sun, I can clearly tell you that I still really, really found it much nicer. I felt I had much less problems with my sleep, because the UK actually keeps to its real chronotime. And that the Netherlands, France, everything, they should actually be switching. Now, why do we say we should be switching? Because it really makes them suffer more. So this is a nice graph where the longitude of where the country is is on the one axis, and then the other time is the average time of work start. We all have a social convention of starting work kind of between 8 and 9, but when do we really start will actually be perfectly correlated to where you are in Europe, because it depends on the sun. And then you see that people in Vienna, right, they will start a little bit earlier, and then you start later, the farther west you go. And Santiago de Chile is this poor little place that's completely in that peak in Spain, so it's the most western part of our Central European Standard Time. And poor them, they're really off thing. And so if they would be allowed to actually start their working hours according to the sun, then you would actually get that red line correlation. So that would be perfect. Then actually, okay, it would be fine. That seems that in humanity, we're just ignoring the clock in a way, and we just still live our times. But that's not true. As you see, the gray line is the actual correlation, which means it's a bit shifted. So actually in Santiago de Chile, in Madrid, in Paris, all these places, they're actually working too early. So they will be suffering more from this misalignment of sun time and biological time. And that it really is not good for you. This is can be seen a bit here. It's a complicated graph, but I'll explain it. So what you see from top to bottom is 1 year. Actually, it's 2 years, sorry. They show 2 years so you could see the cycling. And then what you see in the black on the top, that's always when it's standard time. And then the white bar is always when it's daylight saving time, so the summer. And then you could see the amount of mid-sleep and the wake-up, and then don't focus too much on the individual curves. Look at the main general kind of oscillation. And what you see there is what you heard already before, is that it is completely natural that we will get up earlier when there's more sunlight. We will get up later if there's less sunlight. And we will also sleep more in the winter, and we're going to sleep less in the summer because of the light exposure. Because light is our main entrainer, and that's what kind of keeps us going in a way. The light in the morning for the late chronotypes, and the light in the afternoon for the early chronotypes, that's what we need to kind of get going. But then what you can see on the right is the actual sleep duration. And as I said, it is that variation. But what you could see is that every time we have a switch of time zones, it falls out of the curve in a way. So right now, this is the time switch we just did. Where everybody switched from standard time to from daylight saving to standard time. And as you can see there, we should be sleeping more and more. We should be going slowly into our winter hibernation in a way. But what happens is, even so we have an extra hour, right? Those people, oh, I had that extra hour to sleep. We sleep less. And that's just because our bodies can become incredibly confused when it comes to this misalignment. I see it every time in myself. It happened again, even so I deliberately switched all the clocks this time. That part of me is, oh, I'm really tired now. Wait, what time is it? No, it's 7. No, it was 6 yesterday. No, it's 6. I keep trying to find out what time it is and which thing, and I cannot just accept that this is now the new time. And the other thing that I've not really noticed, because again, I come always with my toddler, with him I really noticed that he adapts his sleep timing to the season. And so he clearly became later, but he didn't become later now. And I think every kid in our daycare, I bet you could measure it in a way of how punctual we all arrive, is that so our kids switched already 2 months ago. So actually, they've been getting later since July, since the sun started getting later. That's when they started shifting later. So doing it now is just too late. We should have done this 2 months ago, then maybe it wouldn't have had any influence on our rhythms. But right now, it was kind of the most desperate last moment where you could still do it. And ironically, you see the same thing there in the other switch back, where you lose a time, but then you suddenly are sleeping more. And what when you align it, what you actually see is that there is the switching maybe does make sense. However, we do it currently wrong. If you would just shift it all by 2 months, then these curves potentially would be much smoother. So I could say, as a summary in a way, from the chronobiologists per se will all tell you to abolish daylight saving. They think it just kind of mixes up everything and it just disturbs our sleep. I don't think it's really wrong, but as I said, I think it's at the wrong time point. But the more important thing is that, why are we so enslaved by this clock? I mean, there are certain situations where you need it, right? Where we need to have someone working in shifts, where we need someone in the hospital. We cannot have someone just deciding to work late. But the majority of people are currently working in offices, where it doesn't actually make a difference if they start working at 8 or 9. The main thing is that it should be important how much they work. And so it should be much more the thing about, why do we keep our enslavement kind of to these devices, even so we don't need it. Now, before going on to the discussion, I would want to already do my little thank you, but the main reason I have to do my little thank you is that I actually am not a chronobiologist. I'm a sleep researcher who works on memory, so kind of different topic. And so everything I talked about today was not anything that I know about, actually, but I mainly know about because I know of the work from Till Rönneberg. And so Till Rönneberg is a Munich chronobiologist, and all the figures I showed are from him, so that's why the biggest thank you goes to him. And the main thing is that if you are interested in this topic, one thing I can definitely recommend is that he wrote a book. And he wrote a really, really nice book. And that book you can read as a scientist, and you will still respect, even as a sleep scientist, I still really, really respected this book. But it also is very good to read if you have no clue about science or sleep or anything whatsoever. So that would be it before we now start with time discussion.
Okay. Thank you both for these very enlightening lectures. This was a lot of information which raises a lot of questions. Maybe Christoph, in your talk, so you talked about the invention of the clock, and it started as an alarm clock, and then you get to the cities or the towns for trade, but that doesn't explain the fact that we've all now become slaves to the clock, and that we all our lives, be it rural or city life, is actually indeed dictated by the clock, and I'm going to ask you why it is so wrong. But how can you tell that story? I have the idea that there's a missing link here.
Oh yeah, there are lots of missing links, which I can't tell you how many slides I had to cut out again. I mean, you get really interesting trials in urban cities where the workers should start, let's say, at 8 o'clock, and they should start at 5. And then some still, you see centuries basically of saying, should I follow the Church of St. Anthony or the Church of because they are all out. Each town is somewhat, out of sync with the others. And then you get the great discussion, should we stick to these old hours, which are adjustable through the year, where you start counting with sunset, or should we just have this other one? And you can see that city after city, and the mercantile centers, they switch. They are the first ones because they have, I don't know, a big naval company and so forth. And well, there will be a long story to tell, and one has to do with illumination too. If you go to, for example, to Florence, you will see lots of palaces which have these iron rings on the facade, and so you can put torches there. So that this is actually a question I want to ask to you: what's the relation between the genetic chronotype and the availability of light? So a village used to be simply dark at night, and you go to bed, and then you get up with the rooster. Cities started already in the late Middle Ages, early modern period to be illuminated. So you could continue working later. You could start earlier because there was this illumination. Mm-hmm. But I think the story of how many legal battles there were to force people to start even when it was already dark in the winter, that's a fascinating story to tell.
Yeah, but bottom line?
Well, bottom line is well, the word is simply efficiency and teamwork. So once you have a factory, it just doesn't bloody matter to you when the sun gets up and sun gets down.
Yeah. So we're talking really late 19th century here?
Well, no. Well, I was trying to say that it was being negotiated over 4 centuries, basically.
Yeah.
Well, I had a nice slide for the Dutch speakers here, and of the vroedschap van the stad. Utrecht, which in the 18th century decides to have one clock that's going to overrule all the others, and all the others then have to adjust to this one. Yeah. And gone is the solar time. This one is, So you can see the kind of mercantile society then at some point saying, well, we are just going to be more efficient if we have one standard time throughout the year.
Yeah. And then the question to you, so you're obviously very enraged by this fact that we all have to stick to the clock. But and you say you're not a chronobiologist, but you are a neuroscientist. What is so wrong about it?
So of course we don't actually. I mean, the one thing is personal suffering. Lake chronotypes, since I'm a lake chronotypes, Till Rönneberg is also a lake chronotype. That's why we can't go into that field of research, because you've been suffering. I mean, how much of my time have I, especially high school, the main time of learning, where I should be sleeping a lot, right? I always being tired and wanting to sleep. I mean, that's I was the reason why I'm personally enraged in a way of it's an unfair part of society. That society currently is actually giving a preference to a part of society that is a more early risers, while the late risers just are currently being in a way suppressed. And so that's the one. And since I belong to that group, I feel personally enraged. But of course, on the long term, the bigger problem is it causes probably health issues. I mean, there is a lot of systematic research yet into this, but it has been done in shift workers, for example. So shift working, while it will be impossible to completely abolish because of efficiency in factories, as well as more importantly that we have 24-hour healthcare. If I have a heart attack at night, right, I want someone to take care of me. But the problem is, as I said, with shift workers, if you then look at their health problems, is that yes, they, as shift workers, have a higher risk for metabolic diseases, for heart diseases, for everything, and it's probably due to the fact that they're living so misaligned in a way to not only their chronotype, but in generally they don't have any stable rhythmicity in a way.
And the other thing connected to that, a question connected to that, you neurotypes, you always talk about evolution. I was missing the evolution here, because you talked about it genetically determined, which means that there are indeed different chronotypes. How does this fit with the evolutionary history of mankind?
So in general, what we also keep in mind, right, we always say when we talk about ecological niches, the idea is that the 24 hours, right, will take any physical spatial niche and create a fourth dimension on it, right? Because now you will have the same spatial environment that can be used by one niche if they focus and specialize on one time of day, and can be used by some other species at a different time of day, right? So they're actually, you're creating more niches by using the 24 hours. That's why if you look across all species in on the world, everyone will have a circadian rhythm. There is, I think, nothing, even a single yeast cell has a circadian rhythm. But every circadian rhythm will be adapted, right? Well, some animals are night active, some are dusk-dawn active. We are generally daylight active. But of course, what also nature kind of, or didn't do intentionally, of course, because it's nature, but what happens with evolution is that we also, within the species, try to diversify. And what you're actually creating, if you create this more chronotypes, is that you have actually some who can benefit from one part of the day, while others can take the advantage of the other part of the day. But the main difference, probably, I mean, the problem is we don't really know because we can't go back into right when we lived in caves. But the main reason is probably that the early chronotypes, they're better at getting up with the sun, so they're better at using the daylight time. But the late chronotypes are much better at skipping a night. Because the reason you actually are early chronotype or late chronotype is if your internal clock is shorter than 24 hours or longer than 24 hours. And so if your internal clock is shorter than 24 hours, you're an early chronotype, and then you need the sun, and that's where the light exposure comes in, at the end of the day to entrain your bodily clock to be lengthened to 24 hours. While, as I said, the late chronotype is actually longer than 24 hours, and that's why it needs the sun in the morning to be able to reshift in a way, that oh no, the day begins now, the day begins now in a way. And so the advantage of that late chronotype who has this longer day is that they can, as I said, skip a night. And so potentially, that's at least Till Rönneberg's theory, is that the late chronotype actually is the better hunter. Because it's the one who can actually be in the bush during dusk and dawn, which is the best time for hunting, and can wait till something comes, not fall asleep, not be the brother who's waiting to ring the matins and then falls asleep. Right, the late chronotype wouldn't fall asleep. They're better at kind of keeping awake.
And also keep watch at night and protect the others.
Yes, and so that's kind of where everybody has their advantage and disadvantage, and that's also probably why it changes throughout your own lifetime, because in a way the hunter is the person who is at the peak of their fitness in their life, and that would fit to that it's the end of adolescence. So it's like 20 when you're most fit. That's also when you're the latest, and so those could be the ones who kind of do the hunting, while the other ones do the gathering or child minding.
Yeah.
And it's the same time kids, right? You don't want to have a child awake, wandering off in the dark when a predator can eat it. So that's why for them it's better to be awake during the day.
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. And I think a question for both of you. I was struck by in both your I sort of had a question with both of your lectures, where the cultural factor comes in your story. You mentioned Germany, because you are German, a couple of times, and I lived in Germany, and I think I'm changing a little bit. I was a late chronotype, so it meant that on Saturdays I had 1 hour to do the shopping because the shops closed at 12. I think they still do in some parts of Germany. So there's a cultural factor. It's a fact of German culture, and I was also thinking in your story, the rise of the cities, mercantile. So also there seems to be a cultural factor. Where does culture fit in this story about the clock and the way our biorhythms are adapted to that? Are the Germans fitter in the morning, or what is going on?
Where it comes from, he will have to answer.
Yeah,
I do not know.
that's his.
That's his part. But one thing I could say is that culture has given us a lot of the guilty feelings, but that's general culture. I think that's cross culture in a way of, for example, why do we say early riser and long sleeper? Because, right, it's either an early riser or a late riser, or you're either a short sleeper or a long sleeper. If you sleep till 11 a.m., it doesn't necessarily mean that you slept very, very long. You could have gone to bed at 5 a.m.
Yeah.
And so that alone is this thing, right, where we have all of our cultural wording is always for the morning, right? It's the early bird catches the worm, right? And everything. And it implies that if you sleep long, you're lazy. And that is actually, I think, it's still maybe a Western thing, but if you, again, will probably know it better, because what I found fascinating is that in a lot of Asian cultures, it's, for example, completely fine to sleep in class. Because they say if you sleep while you're being taught, it's just because you stayed up all night and you studied. That's why it's a good sign. The ones that are sleeping in class are the really, really hard-working ones, because they're so tired from all that hard work. And I found that always fascinating, because it's a bit different in a way, I would say here. If you sleep in class, you would kind of count as a lazy one. So, But then maybe you can...
Maybe Christoph, you can add to this.
Not really, because I'm always feeling uneasy when I hear the word culture. I mean, even the word agriculture is a culture.
Yeah.
So it's there is actually no human society without already some rhythm and division of labor and culture. So I don't know where culture comes in. But one of the things I found so funny about the earliest people who did propose a kind of late light savings time were referring to the fact that in cities, and I get back to my city topic, that life simply goes on. I mean, you mentioned that social activities. In a small village, when the lights are out, there's not that much you can do. And Benjamin Franklin, in this letter which I showed, he says, well, all these beautiful things in Paris, you know, the opera and theater, and so it's all in the night. And you use all these torches and so forth. And then, of course, that's all vices of nocturnal life. And then you illuminate the place, and then, of course, you're not even getting tired. And then in the morning when the sun is out, and you wouldn't need any torches, you know, everyone is asleep, at least the upper classes. Yeah. But, you know, where does culture start? I wouldn't even know. I just see different cultures developing different rhythms and, of course, detaching themselves more and more of an agricultural rhythm where your own chronotypes have to be or your own sleep rhythms have to be adjusted to that of the animals of which you are taking care.
Yeah, and you mentioned Asia. Your story is a European story, and it originated in Europe. How does this relate to the rest of the world? The rest of the world just was committed to this, Greenwich Mean Time and that kind of stuff? Do you know anything about how that worked? Chinese have clocks.
Can I tell there is in the history of science there is a big riddle, and the riddle has always been the riddle of the Chinese clock. Yeah. Because we all want to get rid of Eurocentric stories, and in the case of technology, that's quite easy because the Chinese were so much early with many things. So they had in the something like first millennium BC, they had a huge water wheel with an ingenious technique and box that were being filled, and then it moved again. And people always said, yeah, but they have in a way a mechanical clock. It doesn't work the way ours does. It's very complicated. It took years to build. But why didn't they invent the clock? But the interesting thing is that they actually only used it for the emperor and the astronomers to draw what in English is called an orrery, a kind of a cosmological system that would show how no one had ever the idea of applying that to daily life. They were able to measure it. They had trumpeters in the city sort of saying, now it's 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. But they kept to these elastic hours in which people actually sleep and work. So the question is, we are so used that we are all the slaves of our watch, and all our watches show the same time. The Chinese could have had it, but they were wise enough to say, sod it. Yeah. Let's give this to the astronomers. They are up all night anyway. Yeah. And we keep sleeping. So it's actually an invention that even in Europe, it wasn't welcome at first. It was, as I said, it was invented invented as an alarm clock, and then it was something so fascinating. Many of these old clocks that you see in Strasbourg, and so forth, are actually, again, cosmological models, and you went to marvel at them. You didn't want to follow that rhythm.
Yeah.
And it was really mercantilism and factories and so forth that then led to the imposition of that of that horrid
dictatorship where we all suffer from, especially the late the owls, as you mentioned them. I was fascinated. So you actually make the proposal of keeping daylight saving time, but having it earlier.
Yeah, but that's just
July.
my personal idea since 2 months. So
Okay.
No, I think this general sleep community or a chrono community would say abolish because
The whole thing.
the whole thing because it makes it worse. And if they would suggest we should switch back to time zones that are actually according to latitude. So that's why, in a way of going back to that picture you showed, where you would see that we would actually have a switch in France.
Yeah. But that would mean we would, because I have to calculate, that would mean we would lose these fantastic long nights in summer, wouldn't it?
The night stays the same. The same thing when you ask people, like when you put an alarm clock, you are aware that the day doesn't become longer. You're just shortening your sleep.
Yeah.
And sleep is important for many functions. So that's why the night doesn't change.
Okay.
You keep that in mind. It doesn't change anything.
Yeah, I need some rethinking here.
Yeah.
Well, you have to unlearn.
I have to unlearn. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of I have to unlearn actually. But right. Okay. But still. So if we abolish the whole thing, we abolish daylight saving time. We're still not there where you want us to be, because what I think you were actually talking about was flexible office times.
Yes. So I would say
That's
the
what
main
you're
thing
talking
is
about.
daylight saving. It doesn't really make a big difference or anything. In the end, the main thing that would make more sense is have flexible times for the where it's possible. It's not, as I said, I don't want my medical to just decide to work later when he should have a shift in the morning. So as I said, where it's possible, flexibility, and adjusting to children. Because currently the biggest sufferers from this are the teenagers, are the high school children who have to get up way too early for their natural chronotimes. It's like if I would wake you up at 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. and say, now learn especially, not only awake, but learn. And so that, for example, there have been pilots in the US to have schools start later. And those pilots have clearly shown that the kids don't go later to bed. They just sleep longer. They are less sick. They are more at school. They concentrate better and they have better grades. And so it's already now an official recommendation by the Pediatric Society in the US that all schools should start later. And so that would be the minimum. I mean, as I said, the Netherlands I already find fine. It's already better. But in a way, for the Netherlands, for the more natural thing, we would need the default 9 a.m. start to be abolished, but to have in the Netherlands, let's say 10 to 11 as a natural starting time, where of course some could start an hour earlier, some could start an hour later. But let's say 10 to 11 as a normal starting time, then you would actually be capturing the average society. And then for kids, as I said, they should be then also more like 10, 11, so more that time. And then, but for flexible, it should be flexible.
Okay, so that's really the proposal.
Yes, and don't use an alarm clock. I only have an alarm clock turned on in the rare occasion that I do have some appointment that I should be there for, right? And that potentially is a bit early, and that way there is a risk of me sleeping longer. But then even then I will deliberately put the alarm clock like 10 minutes after I should naturally get up.